Hello, my name's Chris Rogers. I'm the supply chain analyst with S&P Global Market Intelligence, and I'm going to be talking to you today on the topic of Into the Great Unknowns, our supply chain outlook for the rest of 2020 and beyond. The ideas that I'm going to be covering today have all been published in Panjiva Research, and the charts I'm going to show to you today are drawn from our data and services. You'll be able to find all the information at panjiva.com/research. In today's presentation, I'm going to be taking you through three main areas. First, I'm going to be talking about our analysis of the impact of COVID-19 on global supply chains. Second, I'm going to be talking about the relations between the US and China and how they might change going into the US general elections. And thirdly, I'm going to be taking a pen sketch view of trade policy around the world with a focus on the potential impact on Asian supply chains in particular. There'll also be the opportunity for you to ask questions, and you can enter these on the Q&A box on your screen. Let's get started with the four stages of COVID-19. Four stages we've seen are first, the breakdown of supply chains. Second, demand destruction. Third, the phased reopening of markets. And fourth, and the area we're not at yet, is the long-term planning that companies will have to go through to ensure their resilience for the future. Starting firstly with the breakdown of supply chains, it certainly appears to us in our data that countries that locked down later suffered more. The chart on the right that you can see shows exports by origin, and you can see that China, which shut first, did have a significant downturn, but it reversed very quickly. The reopenings and closures that we've seen in China have therefore resulted in growth more recently, whilst other countries are still in a marked downturn. The export-reliant economies, particularly South Korea, has suffered more. The disruptions are also still being felt 6 months down the line. And the fact that there's openings and reclosures potentially being decided at a local layer means that disruptions are going to continue for quite some time. Second and more significant stage is the destruction of demand. Global trade had already been in an extended downturn throughout 2019, and trade between the US and China had already been weakened by tariffs. Now, initially, even essential imports dropped to the United States, and that's provided a subsequent justification for reshoring strategies by the US government. The chart that you see here shows you the imports to the US by sea, sorted by global industrial classification. The discretionary sector and energy sectors have done worse through the period, although consumer discretionary is beginning to recover at the moment. Consumer staples, which includes home and personal care, have recovered, and healthcare took a long time to begin growing. It's worth bearing in mind that the downturn really came during the seasonal trough for demand, and as a consequence of which, that's not had a significant impact initially on the logistics sector. However, more recently, we've begun to see some serious challenges coming through for logistics, and it's made planning for the peak season much more difficult for most companies. There's certainly also been challenges for the e-commerce and direct-to-customer segments, where supplies have had to be used, have had to come through air freight as well as through sea freight. In terms of the shipping sector, we've seen some real problems emerge just in the past few weeks. We've begun to see significant congestion at the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach, and we're also beginning to now see a surge in shipping rates. And that surge, which has led shipping rates from China to Los Angeles to reach their highest in over 5 years, has now led the Chinese government to start to investigate the shipping companies and the rates that they've been charging. When it comes to demand destruction, not all companies have been behaving in the same manner. In the chart that we show here, we look at the imports to the US of specifically home appliances, and that includes everything from hoovers to microwave ovens to washing machines and so on, some of which have been bought online, some of which are bought in stores. There was a marked downturn, obviously, in imports in the first quarter, and at the beginning of the second quarter, the stores remained closed. However, we've seen a marked spread in performance between companies that were perhaps taking a more bullish outlook, like Electrolux, whose shipments have grown throughout the period, Miele, which initially had cut but has more latterly increased its shipments, and both Samsung and LG Electronics, who've actually been cutting their shipments fairly significantly over time. And that in part reflects a degree of reshoring with the opening of factories in the United States. I think it's also worth bearing in mind that we're beginning to see in the second quarter earnings season the impact on inventories. And we've seen many companies across the consumer discretionary sector, particularly firms that are based in Japan and Taiwan, that have seen an explosion in their inventories. And that's largely been due to the phased reopening of their production markets ahead of the demand markets, including the United States and Europe. And that complexity is likely to remain in place for quite some time. I think it's also worth bearing in mind that a lot of companies in their second quarter earnings statements have been warning that the disruptions could continue for quite an extended period. For example, just in the past few days, we've had companies across the toy industry state that the disruptions won't just last for the current shipping season, but also into 2021 as well. Additionally, when we held a survey at a recent webinar as to when investors and corporates expected there to be a full recovery from COVID-19 demand destruction, many companies and investors said, around 60% in fact, said it would take until 2021 for that to straighten out, and possibly even 2022. This is very much a long-term challenge. As I mentioned already, we're beginning to see the phased reopening of industry and commerce, and that obviously started with China in March, followed by much of the rest of Asia in late April, the US more recently in May, and Mexico and elsewhere beginning to reopen in June. The chart on the right here shows you shipments of auto parts from Mexico, and there was obviously a significant drop, in some instances to zero, as a result of the very harsh closures that we saw in the Mexican market. That had a knock-on effect downstream to the automakers in the United States and beyond, many of whom reopened factories and then had to close them again. And again, we've had commentary from the Japanese automakers over the past month or so, effectively saying that they've gone through a stop-start process in reopening. The reason I mention this is that we're continuing to see variations in local regulations with regards to opening and closures, including within Europe, a shift even within countries to reopen or close different areas. So again, it's difficult for companies to know how to reopen, when to reopen, and what the knock-on effects would be throughout their supply chains. I think it's worth saying as well that most companies, when they've been giving their guidance for the coming 3 months and into the end of 2020, have been saying that they don't expect, or they base their guidance at least, on no secondary closures in markets. And that's potentially a big assumption to make. Looking ahead to the fourth stage, the long-term supply chain planning decisions being made by companies. Frankly put, we haven't really seen any companies yet either start to talk about this issue or restructure their supply chains to deal with this issue. And I wouldn't expect those conversations to be had at least until the fourth quarter, and possibly not until the fourth quarter reporting season in the first quarter of 2021. One of the reasons for that is that government support schemes are going to be critical within companies' decision-making. And in that regard, many governments are only now beginning to think about issues such as how they're going to prioritize their medical supply chains, and whether they're going to look at more extensive industrial support policies in order to encourage reshoring and reduction of risk. The chart on the right here shows you US imports of different products within the medical sector from China. The bottom axis shows you China as a proportion of the US in the first half of this year, and the vertical axis shows you the year-over-year change in imports from China to the United States. You can see for PPE, that's personal protective equipment, masks, gloves, drapes, eyewear, and so on, that China's really come to dominate US supplies and has been a major source of growth throughout the first half of this year. And clearly that's something that's viscerally been disliked by the Trump administration, and frankly put, former Vice President Biden has talked about mitigating that as well. We're also beginning to see moves in India and Japan to encourage the reshoring of manufacturing capacity, not just in the healthcare sector, but also in other sectors as part of long-term industrial development plans. And those are really only going to play out in terms of policies in the next 6 to 12 months, and in terms of corporate actions in the next year to 3 years or so. We're also, within medical supply chain, beginning to see more of the form of regional cooperation. We saw that within the European Union in the March to May period, and we've seen discussions in the ASEAN group, or so-called ASEAN +3, to also have centralized stockpiles of medical supplies in the event that we see a resurgence in the pandemic. So in conclusion on COVID-19, we're only just starting to see the recovery, and it's going to take quarters rather than months to get through a full recovery, and firms will need to start addressing their long-term strategies. I mentioned already the differences in views between the Trump administration and former Vice President Biden ahead of the US elections. And one of the defining geopolitical issues over the next few months is going to be the rivalry between the US and China, and how that plays out during the pre-election period. If we take a look at the policies of President Trump, firstly, those have been very much driven by tariffs. The chart on the right here shows you the orange line, US imports from China, the blue line, US exports to China, and the purple line is the trade deficit the US holds with China. And you can see here that there's been a steady drop in US imports from China over the past year or two as a result of tariffs that have been applied really across the board. Now, the tariff-led strategy has effectively done its job in reducing imports, but it's also crushed trade more broadly, and that's not been good for the economy of either country. Now, admittedly, the true picture has probably been hidden by COVID-19. You can see the significant drop we saw in shipments during the first couple of months of this year. But on an underlying basis, I think we're seeing that downturn as well. Now, it's worth bearing in mind that whilst this has been framed very much as a trade war and a tariff war, it is very much about long-term technological rivalry. And as a consequence of which, whilst we're dealing with tariffs now, these issues aren't going to go away anytime soon. So the question, of course, is if we're comparing President Trump and former Vice President Biden, who's tougher on China? Now, the phase one trade deal that was structured between the US and China, which I'll talk about in a moment, was very much designed by the Trump administration to try and turn trade pressure into action on Chinese policy. So far, we haven't seen much in the way of action in that regard. And in fact, if President Trump does win the elections, we believe his policies are going to be very much more of the same. Former Vice President Biden, meanwhile, has also set out a tough on China stance, for example, saying there is no going back to business as usual on trade, and he wants to win the competition for the future against China or anyone else. But it's likely that he'll follow a multilateralist approach rather than focusing purely on the tariff-driven unilateral approach that President Trump has shown so far. And we could see things like the exports to China play out on a state-by-state basis, particularly in battleground states. The chart on the right here shows you what's happened in terms of exports to China versus global exports by state for some of the key battlegrounds. And you can see for places like Arizona, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, the trade war has acted to the detriment of those states, whereas in other states, including Florida and North Carolina, that's less clear. So we are going to see, I think, more commentary on the trade war from both sides over the next couple of months. Looking specifically at the phase one trade deal, frankly put, so far, the deal is very much out of compliance. The US and China were supposed to hold negotiations on August the 15th to discuss progress on delivering the phase one trade deal, and those were not held. Now, the reason for that, I think, is manifold, or there's several reasons to it. The big one, however, is that China is well behind schedule in terms of the purchasing commitments that it made. Remember, it committed to making additional purchases in 2021 versus 2017 of $200 billion. Now, as of the middle of June, It's already $38 billion behind schedule on that. The charts that we see here that you'll be able to look at in more detail when you download the PowerPoint of this presentation shows on the left-hand side the development of agricultural, energy and manufactured goods sales. Agriculture has yet to pick up, although there are some significant sales of soybeans and corn and pork being made. Energy's begun to pick up, but China's demand for LNG and oil has been limited. We have seen some increases in purchases by China of manufactured goods, but ironically, the fastest growth has actually been in semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, and optical and medical products. So the very high-tech products that the Trump administration has been trying to limit access to. The chart on the right shows you the purple line, which is the target purchases that China should be making. The orange line is where China actually is, and the dotted line is where China needs to get to in order to meet its commitments. It's pretty clear that China is at only 1/2 of its target, and as a consequence of which, it is well behind schedule. Now, the question is, why hasn't the phase one trade deal been cancelled already? And the simple point there is that President Trump's in quite a difficult situation. On the one hand, he should pull out of the deal in order to show he's tough on China. However, that may give room for him to be, frankly put, beaten up by Biden going into the elections for poor deal making. But overall, the relations between China and the US probably haven't been at a worse stage than this for quite some time. The US has made widespread use of sanctions, including in relation to Hong Kong and Xinjiang. There's been technological restrictions put in place, most recently against Huawei, as well as ByteDance and Tencent. And there's also investment restrictions going to be put in place as well. As a consequence of which, relations are worsening, and it's tough to see what's going to improve them, certainly in the next few months. And we may well see a maintenance of this poor position, at least until after the elections. The question is, what are companies doing about it? And the companies have to deal with a situation where tariffs could get tighter, they could be removed altogether, or status quo could continue. Similarly, they may need to deal with non-tariff barriers. So, for example, the technology sales restrictions that have been put in place with regard to Huawei and other companies. As those spread, that's going to complicate supply chains as well, not just because of direct sales to Chinese companies, but because of components that are imported from China, or even components that are exported from China to third countries to be included in products that are sent to the United States. It's never been more important for companies, investors and other decision makers to fully understand the supply chains they're involved in from top to bottom. When we're looking at what companies have been doing so far, many have already been reducing their exposure to China, but need to do a lot more. On this chart, you see two companies. On the left, you'll see Whirlpool, the producer of home appliances. It had steadily been reducing its exposure to China over time, but has seen a resurgence more recently in the wake of COVID-19. So far, Whirlpool's been a winner from President Trump's policies because it's seen tariffs applied to its competitors' production of washing machines. However, Whirlpool imports other products, including microwave ovens, that may face tariffs in the future if there's a further breakdown in relations between US and China, possibly with the cancellation of the phase one trade deal. On the right-hand side, we show the picture for printer and camera manufacturer Konica Minolta. Konica has been aggressively reducing its imports from China and may cut them further should we see further changes in relations between the US and China. Some supply chain choices, on the other hand, are relatively easy to make. On the left-hand side, we show you the importers from companies that had sanctions applied against them very recently in relation to alleged abuses in the Xinjiang region of China. And those include Lenovo and Alstom, among others. And these are partly of components used within the United States, but it's also for components that are spread throughout their global supply chains. And again, those will need to be reduced, and most companies have been reducing them already, but that exposure is still there. And whilst it's a simple choice to avoid those areas, it's not particularly easy to implement it. On the right-hand chart, we're showing you the imports to the US of Ninebot Segway, the producer of autonomous devices, as well, of course, the iconic Segway personal transporter that's now sadly no longer in production. But we've seen there that Segway had begun to increase its imports from outside of China before reversing that move as they changed their product mix. So again, that's a company that's going to have to review its supply chain in the coming months. Bringing that part together, what we can see is that tough on China is not going away, whether under President Trump again in the future or Vice President Biden. And companies are going to have to make some pretty difficult decisions in the coming months. The third area I want to talk to you about briefly are potential trade policy brush fires elsewhere in the world. Now, the good news in Asia is that we're likely to see the signing of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP, this year. And that could bring a reduced tariff and trade barrier area across Asia, including China, Japan, South Korea, the ASEAN countries, and so on. The challenge for it, of course, is that a number of its partners aren't getting on at the moment. South Korea and Japan have already disrupted each other's supply chains because of a historic disagreement. China and India's not currently part of RCEP, but they all want it to be included, are having border disputes. China's also having arguments more recently with Australia, and that's spilled through to Australia's exports of agricultural products and wine. So all of these frictions make it more difficult for these deals to get done. We may also see the US, under a future potential President Biden, return to the CPTPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership Trade Deal. That may need adaptations. The initial policy platform we've seen from former Vice President Biden would require adaptations to TPP. However, having the US as part of that would be a significant win for Japan and the ASEAN countries that are members of it, and so they may be willing to change the deal to get them on board. Elsewhere, there's lots of complexities to deal with. There's tensions between the US and EU in relation to aerospace, digital, and green taxes. Brexit, my least favourite subject, looks set to end without a transitional deal. The transitional deal will end and there won't be a future deal in place. And that's going to be a challenge really for all European companies and those based elsewhere in the world that deal with the UK. We may fortunately see a UK-Japan trade deal implemented, hopefully by the end of the year. And then globally, the WTO still faces challenges, but the big area that I'm most excited about is the development of the African continental free trade area. We've always been believers at Panjiva that free trade can bolster prosperity and bring peace. And we'd be very happy to see those developments, not just in Africa, but around the world.